Welcome to our exploration of one of the most unsettling cases in Boston's history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. What locations and times of day or night these recorded accounts arrive in Boston, Massachusetts are of interest to us. The cobblestone streets were blown by a cold January wind, which rattled the gas lanterns that threw lengthy shadows in the encroaching darkness. In the midst of the city's growing wealth and success, Trinity Church would be dedicated that year and rise like a monument to faith. Henry Hobson Richardson's magnificent building, with its imposing central tower and enormous stone walls, was almost finished and stood in Copley Square, a testament to the city's increasing religious fervor and stature. But beneath this prosperous city's religious facade, something unimaginable was brewing in the shadows. A horror that would be purposefully removed from official records, a darkness that would not be discussed in civilized society. Boston's aristocracy reveled in its religious establishments and artistic accomplishments, but the city's neglected corners and winding lanes held secrets. This is the story of Father James Whitley, whose name is not included in any church registration, whose tomb is unmarked, and whose actions were concealed in sealed documents until they were uncovered in 1962, while the Massachusetts Historical Society was renovating. During a 1968 records transfer, the files were lost after being promptly categorized. In whispered circles, this individual would be referred to as the corpse lover priest. In 1877, the winter was especially severe. For weeks, the city was buried in snow, turning Boston into a place with ice-glazed streets and white rooftops. Families gathered around small fires in the less affluent areas in an attempt to combat the deadly cold. Under such circumstances, disease spreads easily. Every day, influenza, pneumonia, and consumption claimed lives, adding new graves to the city cemeteries. The city itself was at a juncture where the old and the new met. Only 5 years prior, the downtown area had been mostly damaged by the Great Boston Fire of 1872, and the city had undergone significant transformation during the reconstruction process. As the Back Bay was filled in, additional ground became available for development, and imposing structures like Trinity Church began to rise. With immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe crammed into tenements and Brahmin families holding on to their elegant homes on Beacon Hill and in the increasingly trendy Back Bay, Boston's population had grown to around 360,000. In this setting, medical schools flourished, training the next generation of doctors at Harvard Medical School and a number of lesser institutions. More cadavers were needed for anatomical research at these colleges than could be legally obtained through legitimate procedures. In order to provide medical students with subjects for dissection, a murky business of resurrectionists plundered new graves. Because the practice was so widespread, wealthier families occasionally bought heavy iron coffins that would be challenging to open, or employed guards to keep an eye on their loved ones' graves in the days after burial. The first unsettling thing happened during this time of death. Jane Caldwell shared a little house close to the North End with her aging mother. She was a seamstress at the age of 27, working hard to provide for her mother and herself. She had previously been betrothed to a young clerk who passed away from typhoid before they could tie the knot. She had since dedicated herself to her job and her mother, taking comfort in attending her neighborhood parish church on a daily basis. Neighbors characterized her as a modest girl of good character, who frequently attended church and had no vices until illness claimed her life on the 5th of February, 1877. Neighbors and other seamstresses attended her modest but respectable funeral. On a gloomy afternoon when the snow started to fall again, she was laid to rest in the Old North Church Cemetery. When Malcolm Finch, the groundskeeper, showed up for his morning shift 3 days later, he discovered something that would follow him till the end of time. The grave of Jane Caldwell has been disturbed. The soil was moved and quickly returned, although it was obvious that it had just been dug. Finch alerted the church authorities, who then called the police, since he was afraid of grave robbers, which were very common in those days. They couldn't explain what they found when they dug up the casket. Since Jane's body was still there, the typical grave robbers from medical school who never brought their victims back were ruled out. However, there was a grave problem. An ornate garment reminiscent of that worn by Catholic brides of Christ, nuns completing their final vows, has been placed in place of her burial garments. Her body had been placed with care, her face calm as though she were sleeping peacefully rather than dying, and her hands wrapped over a rosary that had not been interred with her. Worst of all, there was evidence that her body had been treated and cleaned with oils after being taken out of the grave. Tiny remnants of incense stuck to her flesh. Beneath the rosary, in her folded hands, was a small piece of parchment with Latin text. A seminary lecturer later translated the manuscript, which included a modified version of the wedding ceremony that was tailored to the immortal bride. Following this discovery, Malcolm Finch, a devout man who had tended the cemetery for 15 years, asked to be reassigned to church maintenance duties. Finch would later tell his wife that what bothered him most was not the desecration itself, but the care with which it had been done, as if whoever did this felt not malice but love. His request was approved. After being assigned to the case, Detective Francis Holloway was told to keep all information confidential. The wealthy families of Boston would not stand for scandal, especially when it involved the degradation of the deceased. It was documented as basic vandalism. A discreet reburial was planned after the family was informed that animals had damaged the grave. Police confiscated the parchment, the rosary, and the unusual outfit, which later disappeared from the evidence. But Holloway took informal notes. Before joining the Boston Police, he served with distinction during the Civil War and was a methodical man with a well-groomed mustache and piercing gray eyes. He had witnessed the worst of humanity at the age of 43, yet something about this case deeply troubled him. In his private diary, he wrote, February 8, 1877. The Caldwell grave desecration represents something I have not encountered before. This was not the work of medical students or common thieves. The care taken with the body, the ritualistic elements, suggests something far more disturbing. I fear this may not be an isolated incident. The son of Irish immigrants, Holloway had overcome the prejudice against Irish Catholics that persisted in the largely Protestant city by using intelligence and perseverance to advance through the ranks of the Boston Police. His religious background made the case more personally troubling to him, but it also helped him see the ritualistic aspects of the sacrilege that others would have overlooked. He believed that the darkest kind of blasphemy was the distortion of religious rituals for this reason. He was right to be afraid. Another grave in Mount Auburn Cemetery was discovered to be disturbed 3 weeks later. The 24-year-old Elizabeth Winters drowned in the Charles River and was buried the week before. Her body, like Caldwell's, had been taken out and put back in the same ceremonial clothing, seemingly in a state of serene slumber. The marks discovered on her body, which showed signs of cleaning and preparation that medical research was unable to explain, were more unsettling. This time, a tiny silver medallion, a Catholic saint's medal that had not been interred with her, was discovered gripped in her fist. A date, the 25th of February 1877, the night her tomb had been disturbed, was etched into the medal on the back. Elizabeth Winters, the daughter of a Western Massachusetts Protestant minister, had served as a governess for a rich family on Beacon Hill. She had traveled to Boston in search of work and had found a decent job taking care of the Appleton family's kids. She had supposedly fallen from a footbridge while out on her own one winter evening, and her drowning had been declared accidental. The family had arranged for a dignified funeral at Mount Auburn, the posh garden cemetery frequented by many of Boston's wealthier families. The desecration appalled the Appleton family, who used their enormous clout to insist on a full investigation. This placed Holloway in a hard situation. He was now required to maintain discretion in order to avoid scandal or public alarm, but he was also under pressure to find a speedy solution to the matter. If it weren't for Holloway's careful notes, which he kept between February and April of 1877, the connection between these incidents might never have been made. He recorded a pattern that emerged in Boston cemeteries. 7 graves were disturbed in this way. All of them were taken by young women between the ages of 20 and 30. All of them returned to their graves after being taken, and all of them underwent some kind of ritual preparation. Mary Sullivan, A 22-year-old Irish immigrant who passed away from tuberculosis was the third casualty. The fourth was 6-year-old Catherine Delaney, who passed away from pneumonia-related complications. Next in line were 9-year-old Sofia Petrovich, 3-year-old Rebecca Goldstein, and 5-year-old Sarah Thornton. All of them Irish, Italian, Jewish, and Protestant had been changed into the same image, the bride of Christ in death. Holloway made an effort to spot patterns that went beyond the apparent. Yes, they were all young women, but were there others? He pointed out that everyone had passed away naturally, with the exception of Elizabeth Winters, who drowned. None had been the victims of abuse or mishap. Family and friends said they were all good-natured and moral. Within 2 days of their passing, they had all been buried. Most importantly, they had all been laid to rest in graveyards with scant security at night. Holloway conducted interviews with clergymen who had overseen the funerals, funeral directors, and cemetery staff as part of his research. In an attempt to find links between the victims, he created a list of people who had gone to several funerals. He looked over obituaries, noting who could find out about recent deaths. He first heard about James Whitley, a young priest who had just been appointed to a small parish in South Boston as a result of this systematic approach. Although he had not performed the ceremonies, Whitley had attended the services for Catherine Delaney and Sofia Petrovich and had presided at Mary Sullivan's funeral. Whitley provided little helpful information throughout the interview, but he did express the proper horror at the desecrations. Father Whitley strikes me as an unremarkable man, Holloway stated in his notes, scholarly in demeanor, soft-spoken, with nothing in his manner to suggest unwholesome tendencies. Yet there is something in his eyes when discussing the deceased, an intensity that seems inappropriate to our conversation. I will make further inquiries into his background. According to those questions, Whitley had attended seminaries in Maryland and Pennsylvania prior to receiving his ordination in Boston 8 months prior. His superiors said he studied hard and was especially interested in burial ceremonies and old church customs. He would have been familiar with the care and preparation of bodies because he had worked briefly as an assistant to an undertaker in Baltimore prior to enrolling in the seminary. The following passage was taken from Holloway's private journal, which was discovered among his belongings upon his passing in 1891. The pattern indicates that the criminal chooses victims based on certain criteria and returns them to their final resting place after carrying out some sort of ritual. While most grave robbers aim only to sell bodies to medical schools, this particular criminal wants something completely different from the dead. April 12, 1877. I have been keeping an eye on new graves in all of Boston's major cemeteries. April 15th, 1877. Tonight, I saw a lone figure enter Granary Burying Ground just after midnight, carrying only a small black bag, and he proceeded, purposefully, straight to a grave that had been dug only yesterday, and I stayed behind a large monument, and the night was cold, with a thin fog creeping between the headstones, and the figure worked efficiently, using a specialized tool to remove the soil with minimal disturbance, and within an hour he had opened the grave and was lifting the coffin lid. I could not see exactly what happened next, but he remained hunched over the open coffin lid for almost half an hour before carefully replacing the lid and filling the grave. His movements were not those of a common thief, but methodical, almost reverent, and I found myself thinking of a priest performing a sacred rite rather than a criminal engaged in desecration. April 16th, 1877. Another night of observation. The same figure reappeared, this time at Mount Auburn Cemetery, where he worked alone once more, opening a new grave and removing the body. I followed from a distance but lost him near the Charles River. I have made arrangements for the exhumation of the coffin tomorrow under the guise of a family's request for relocation. The body was that of Hannah Wheeler, age 26, who died of influenza 4 days ago. She had undergone the same ritualistic preparations as the others, wearing the same clothes and posing in the same serene manner, but this time there was something different. A small lock of the perpetrator's hair had been placed in her hand, wrapped in a piece of paper that read, "Unto my bride, eternally joined." The handwriting matches certain parish records written by Father James Whitley, the 17th of April, 1877. I've been pursuing the grave robber for 3 nights now. He arrives alone, with just a small bag and some tools, and works surprisingly efficiently for a man of his size. I'm going to confront him tonight. The grave robber is identified in the April 18th record as Father James Whitley, a recently assigned priest at a small South Boston parish. Holloway's account is telling. He did not run when discovered. He stood calmly beside the open grave, his clerical collar visible in the moonlight, and asked if I would like to see how the dead could be made beautiful again. Whitley was a contradictory man. After a delayed entry into the priesthood, he was only recently ordained and was in his early 32nd. Before moving to Boston, records showed that he had attended a seminary in Baltimore for a brief period of time. His features were plain, neither handsome nor ugly, with wire-rimmed spectacles that made him look like a scholar and brown hair that was starting to recede. His parishioners characterized him as intelligent, quiet but attentive, and especially sympathetic to the bereaved. Later on, this final element would become a darker hue. Whitley, who kept thorough records of burials and had a special interest in the younger female corpses, had offered to perform funeral ceremonies when other priests were unable. He kept a tiny notebook of clippings from obituaries, concentrating on women who had passed away naturally, especially those who were characterized as virtuous or adored. The confrontation at the gravesite was described in detail in Holloway's journal. I identified myself as a police detective and ordered him to step away from the grave. He complied without resistance, his manner calm, almost relieved, as if he had been waiting for this moment. When I asked what he was doing, he replied, completing what death has left unfinished. He spoke with the confidence of a man performing a necessary duty rather than a criminal caught in the act. I placed him under arrest, confiscating his bag, which contained oils, incense, ceremonial garments, and several small religious artifacts modified in ways I do not recognize from Catholic tradition. As we walked toward the cemetery gate where my colleague waited, Whitley spoke at length about sacred unions beyond death and brides awaiting their eternal bridegroom. His words were a disturbing mixture of Catholic theology and something far older and darker. Most unsettling was his demeanor, not that of a man caught in a shameful act, but of a priest attempting to educate me about sacred mysteries I was too limited to comprehend. They are not defiled but sanctified, he said. Through me they achieve the purest union possible, one uncorrupted by earthly desires, preserved in the perfect state of death. Records from the private archives of the Boston Police Department show that Whitley was arrested that evening but was freed a few hours later thanks to the help of an unidentified church official. There were no charges brought. The next day, Holloway was demoted from his detective role and placed on patrol duty in the North End. Holloway wrote down his last exchange with Captain Sullivan, his commander, in his journal. April 19th, 1877. Sullivan informed me that the Whitley matter has been resolved through appropriate channels. When I protested, citing the evidence of multiple grave desecrations, he replied coldly, Boston has no interest in a scandal involving the Catholic Church. The matter is closed. When I asked what had happened to Whitley, Sullivan would only say that the church handles its own affairs. I have been reassigned to patrol duty, effective immediately. My request to speak with Commissioner Hayes was denied. I cannot abandon this investigation, regardless of official sanction. The violations perpetrated against these women's remains and the perversion of sacred rites for such purposes demand justice. I will continue my inquiries in my private capacity. Private correspondence between Bishop Williams and an unidentified Vatican representative provides incomplete descriptions of what transpired next. Whitley was not defrocked, but he was quietly relieved of his parish responsibilities. Rather, he was given a job at the diocesan archives cataloging funerary documents, which allowed him to have hitherto unheard-of access to data on recent burials and deaths in Boston. Bishop Williams wrote to Father M. at the Vatican on the 25th of April 1877, saying, With regard to Father Whitley, I have done as you have instructed. He has been relieved of his parish responsibilities but is still under our care. Dr. Harrington has examined him and thinks his condition is caused by a nervous disorder that was made worse by his excessive academic pursuits. Father Whitley has expressed a great deal of regret for his academic transgressions and has agreed to regular spiritual counseling with Father Montgomery. We think this is a wiser course of action than involving secular authorities, which would only cause scandal that would harm the church's reputation in Boston at this critical juncture. Any controversy involving clergy and the disrespect of the dead would cast a shadow over all the city's religious establishments, and the magnificent Episcopal Church was almost finished. For over 3 months, the disturbed graves stopped. Then, just before dawn in July, a groundskeeper at Granary Burying Ground found a man praying next to a newly covered grave while dressed in clerical attire. The man ran away when he was confronted. The burial of Martha Simmons, who had been interred the afternoon before, was discovered disturbed that same day. The now familiar ritual process had been used to remove and then return her body. The fact that Martha Simmons had been dead for about a week prior to her funeral because of difficulties in finding family members sets this case apart from the previous ones. Her body would have been severely decomposed, hardly the kind of thing a medical school would be interested in. However, someone had carefully cleaned and arranged her body, adorning it with ritual clothing and placing it in a position of peaceful rest. A letter from Dr. Samuel Harrington of Massachusetts General Hospital to Detective Holloway dated July 18, 1877, provides a disturbing assessment. The body shows evidence of extensive cleaning and preparation consistent with ancient embalming practices, not modern medical techniques. Most troubling are the traces of aromatic oils and resins found on the skin, along with evidence that extensive time was spent with the corpse after this preparation. I cannot speculate on the nature of this attention, but I must express my profound disturbance at what the evidence suggests. Of particular note are the marks on the hands and face, a kind of anointing with oils containing trace amounts of myrrh and aloe, substances mentioned in biblical accounts of burial preparation. The garment itself appears to be hand-sewn, with symbols embroidered along the hem that combine Catholic imagery with older, possibly pre-Christian elements. I must ask, Detective, how you came to involve me in this matter when I understand you are no longer officially assigned to the case. Nevertheless, as a medical professional and a man of conscience, I felt compelled to provide my observations. I have kept no official record of this examination. I would be remiss if I did not mention one final detail. Upon examination of the body, I found evidence suggesting that certain liberties had been taken with the corpse that go beyond funerary preparation. The specific nature of these attentions is too disturbing to commit to writing, even in a private communication. Suffice it to say that whoever performed these acts appears to view these deceased women as objects of devotion in a manner that perverts both religious sentiment and natural affection. I can only hope that the perpetrator is apprehended before his activities progress to even greater desecrations. The letter was never officially filed and was found among Holloway's personal effects after his death. Holloway continued his research informally even after being reassigned. During his off-duty time, he kept an eye on cemeteries, spoke with groundskeepers, and created a thorough map of grave desecrations throughout Boston. He would eventually find something considerably more unsettling than isolated cases of grave robbery because of his perseverance. Holloway watched Father Whitley, with his trademark black bag, leave the diocesan archives in late July. Whitley grabbed a cab to the city's outskirts rather than going back to his small room at the Catholic boarding house where he now resided. Holloway watched from a distance as Whitley got out of the taxi close to a small private cemetery owned by the Adams family, one of the oldest and most prominent families in Boston. Over the course of the following week, Holloway saw Whitley frequently visit this spot, always bringing supplies in his black bag, always coming after dark, and always departing before daybreak. A little stone cottage on the cemetery's edge was erected for a groundskeeper, but had obviously been abandoned for a while. During his visits at night, Whitley traveled to this cottage. By August 1877, it was impossible to ignore the pattern that had developed. 12 graves had been disturbed in several Boston cemeteries, all of them in the same way. Despite being reassigned, Detective Holloway carried on with his investigation, informally, painstakingly recording every case and accumulating proof against Father Whitley. Unusually high temperatures characterized the summer of 1877. The city was left to those who could not afford such amenities, as many affluent Bostonians fled to their summer homes in cooler climates due to the oppressive heat. Heat-related ailments have increased, according to hospitals, especially among the very young and the elderly. As the death rate increased, Whitley's unsettling actions had more opportunity. Trinity Church, whose major dedication was set for September, was almost finished. The majestic building served as a reminder of Boston's religious fervor and affluence. The dynamic rector who had supervised its creation, Bishop Phillips Brooks, was getting ready for the pinnacle of his career. Featuring a huge central tower, elaborate stone carvings, and stunning stained glass windows created by well-known artisans, the church was constructed in the Romanesque style. Beginning in 1872, soon after the Great Boston Fire, construction had continued despite technical difficulties and economic downturns. When finished, it would be among the most striking ecclesiastical structures in the United States, representing the cultural and spiritual ambitions of Boston. Driven by a feeling of justice that would not permit him to relinquish the case despite official apathy, Holloway maintained his lone investigation against this backdrop of religious spectacle and summer heat. Holloway made a finding on the 23rd of August 1877, which would later be removed from all official documents. The following passage from his personal journal describes what Holloway found inside the cottage. I have followed Father Whitley to a small house on the outskirts of Boston, near the old Roxbury line. The building appears to be an abandoned groundskeeper's cottage on the edge of a small private cemetery belonging to the Adams family. Whitley has visited this location for 3 nights, carrying supplies in his black bag. Tonight I gained entry after his departure. The interior resembles a chapel, with candles and religious artifacts arranged around a central table. The table itself is designed like an altar, but fitted with straps and drainage channels. The floor beneath is stained in a manner I cannot bring myself to describe in detail. Most disturbing are the drawings and texts affixed to the walls. Ancient rites of some kind involving the preparation of the dead for what Whitley has termed in his notes, the sacred marriage. I have collected what evidence I can carry and will present it to Commissioner Hayes in the proof. Morning. There is no record of this meeting. Detective Holloway was transferred to Charlestown 3 days later, on August 26th, and all of his unresolved cases were divided among the other detectives. According to reports, an unattended lamp sparked the August 25th fire that destroyed the cottage he had written about in his notebook. However, something else happened before these things happened, something that was only documented in Holloway's private journal in the pages that survived because they were stored separately in a locked desk drawer. August 24th, 1877. I returned to the cottage tonight, determined to gather more evidence before approaching Hayes. What I witnessed will haunt me until my dying day. Whitley was there, performing some kind of ceremony over a body I could not clearly see from my vantage point outside a window. He wore vestments unlike any I have seen in Catholic services, embroidered with symbols that seemed a perversion of religious iconography. He spoke in Latin, but the words were no prayer I recognized from my childhood in the church. The ritual culminated in Whitley producing a small silver knife, cutting his own palm, and pressing the wound to the lips of the corpse in a grotesque parody of communion. I nearly revealed myself then, but caution prevailed. As he concluded the ritual, Whitley extinguished all but one candle and sat beside the body in silence, occasionally stroking its hair with a tenderness that was perhaps the most disturbing element of the entire scene. I waited until nearly dawn, when Whitley finally emerged, loaded the body into a handcart, and proceeded toward what I assume was its original grave. I did not follow, instead entering the cottage to document what I found there. The interior was arranged as a perverse chapel. Candles made of an unusual yellowish wax lined the walls, their light reflecting off numerous small mirrors positioned to illuminate the central altar. The altar itself was draped in white cloth, stained with what appeared to be a mixture of oils, incense residue, and bodily fluids. Straps attached to the sides suggested the bodies were secured in place during the rituals. On a small table nearby lay Whitley's journal, open to a page describing what he called the rite of eternal union. The text combined Catholic marriage ceremonies with elements I did not recognize, references to ancient practices involving the dead that predate Christianity. Most disturbing was the clinical detachment with which he described the physical aspects of these unions, a horrifying blend of religious ecstasy and necrophilic desire cloaked in the language of sacred duty. The walls were covered with drawings, anatomical studies of female corpses, interspersed with religious imagery. Christ as bridegroom, the church as bride, but perverted into something unspeakable. Detailed sketches of the women whose graves had been violated, drawn with the care of a lover, capturing his beloved's likeness. In a trunk beneath the altar I found the ceremonial garments used to clothe the corpses, along with vials of oils, incense, and other materials used in the preparations. Most disturbing of all was a small wooden box containing locks of hair labeled with names and dates, trophies taken from each bride. Several drawings, and the box of hair, and departed before Whitley could return. I will present these to Commissioner Hayes tomorrow morning, along with my complete report. Before Holloway could testify the following morning, he was called into Commissioner Hayes's office. Hayes was joined by a member of the Adams family, one of Boston's most powerful dynasties, and a delegate from the Catholic Archdiocese. The message was unambiguous. The inquiry was concluded. They would deal with it internally. Holloway was ordered to turn over all of the evidence he had gathered and to keep the situation private. Although Holloway maintained his private journal and certain important pieces of evidence, he ostentatiously complied. Whatever evidence was left there was destroyed that night as the cottage burned to the ground. Although an unattended bulb was mentioned as the cause in the official report, Holloway's log indicates otherwise. August 25, 1877. The cottage has been destroyed, obviously to eliminate evidence. I recognize the Adams family representative at the meeting today, Jonathan Adams, whose daughter Emily died last month of scarlet fever. She was buried in the family cemetery near the cottage. I fear I understand now why Whitley chose that location for his blasphemous activities. The Adams, like most of Boston's elite families, value their reputation above all else. The thought that their daughter's remains might have been violated in such a manner would be intolerable, not because of concern for Emily, but for fear of the scandal that would attach to their name if the truth became known. They would rather bury the truth alongside their daughter than see justice done. And what of the church? The representative from the Archdiocese spoke of internal discipline and spiritual correction, but his primary concern was clearly to prevent public knowledge of a priest engaged in such activities. In this city, where Protestants still view Catholics with suspicion, where Irish and Italian immigrants struggle against prejudice, a scandal involving a Catholic priest desecrating graves would set back decades of progress toward acceptance. So they will protect Whitley, not out of compassion, but out of self-interest. The powerful protect themselves, not the vulnerable. Not even the dead are safe from this conspiracy of silence. Until September 1877, Father Whitley remained at the diocese's archives. Trinity Church was dedicated around this time in a lavish event that Boston's aristocracy attended. Since no graves were known to have been disturbed during this time, authorities deemed the issue fixed. Now walking Charlestown streets, Holloway carried on with his unofficial probe, concentrating on historical study rather than active monitoring. Whitley's actions appeared to have historical precedent based on what he found in obscure historical accounts and ancient theological books. There were fringe beliefs about sacred marriage to the dead, ceremonies meant to guarantee that departed good women would be saved through symbolic union with clergy, in some heretical cults that traced their origins to early Christianity. Though fragmented documents existed in certain obscure collections, the Church had condemned these practices, and their practitioners had been executed as heretics. According to one story from the 12th century in France, a priest in a tiny village was found using the bodies of young ladies who had passed away before marriage to execute similar rites. Claiming to function as Christ's agent in connecting these ladies to their heavenly spouse, He had justified his acts by giving them the right of marriage that they had been denied in life. The priest was executed by burning at the end of the story, a death Holloway undoubtedly believed was fitting for Whitley as well. Then something changed on the 12th of October 1877. There is no official police report on this incident, but an entry in the hospital's admission log attests to the fact that a J. Whitley clergyman was treated for injuries on that date. A partial account of the incident can be found in the private papers of Dr. William Ingersoll, a physician at Massachusetts General Hospital. A priest was brought in tonight suffering from severe lacerations to the face and hands. He refused to explain the nature of his injuries but repeatedly asked if any young female patients had died recently. His behavior was so disturbing that I called the police, and before they arrived, a man posing as a representative of the archdiocese took custody of the priest. I have noted the incident in my official report, but I was visited this morning by 2 church officials who requested I remove that entry. I have declined to do so. Until Holloway's relentless inquiry and cultivation of sources within the police department yielded an unauthorized report from an officer who had responded to a disturbance at Mount Auburn Cemetery that same night, it was unclear what had happened to cause these injuries. The report detailed an altercation between a guy in clerical attire who had been seen opening a new grave and the cemetery's night watchman. Before the intruder fled into the night, the watchman, who was carrying a shovel, had struck him multiple times. The burial in question belonged to Harriet Adams, a 19-year-old who was buried that afternoon after passing away from consuming alcohol. Another member of the powerful Adams family is Harriet Adams. There was no denying the connection. Whitley had been intentionally targeting members of Boston's aristocratic families, not simply any good young ladies. In addition to implying Whitley's depravity, the implications were startling because they showed how far influential families would go to hide controversy. Harriet's father, John Adams, was a well-known banker with political ties all throughout Massachusetts and a distant cousin of the previous presidents. Since the early 1800s, generations of Adams had been laid to rest in a tiny private cemetery the family had built on property they owned outside the city. Whitley's access to the site and the strong interest's determination to stifle the investigation were explained by the fact that the groundskeeper's hut, where he had conducted his rites, stood on the edge of this property. An unexpected source, the private journal of Elizabeth Kay, a young woman from a well-known Boston family who volunteered at the hospital, provides the last chapter of this unsettling story. She writes about a conversation she overheard in a hallway between 2 church officials on the 14th of October, 1877. In whispered tones, they discussed Whitley's condition and how it had deteriorated beyond salvaging. One man brought up the Mount Auburn incident, saying that this time the body was still warm. The other man responded that arrangements had been made for immediate transport to the asylum in Worcester and that all records would show a case of nervous exhaustion. The most unsettling exchange was the last one, in which the first man asked, "And what of the girl?" His companion said, "The family has been compensated. As far as anyone knows, their daughter died of fever and was buried yesterday." It was obvious that Whitley had gone beyond disturbing graves and had possibly taken a life. Instead than risking a public scandal, the influential families involved had decided to keep the situation under wraps. Law enforcement, the church, and the highest echelons of Boston society were all implicated. 3 months later, Elizabeth Kay, then 22 years old, passed away from typhoid fever. Her family kept her diaries until 1932, when it was given to the Massachusetts Historical Society. Sometime between 1932 and 1940, when the collection was catalogued, the pages with the Whitley entry were taken out. During the 1962 renovations, a partial copy was found concealed among the pages of an unrelated volume. After hearing about Whitley's wounds and the Mount Auburn event, Holloway reopened his inquiry with new vigor. His late October, 1,877 journal entries show a man consumed with growing fear and a desperate belief that the situation had gotten out of hand to the point of grave desecration. October 20th, 1,877. I have been discreetly asking about recent deaths among Boston's elite families. 3 young women from prominent families have died in the last month. Harriet Adams from consumption, Victoria Lowell from fever, and Eleanor Peabody reportedly from heart failure. All of these deaths were buried in private ceremonies with few people present, and I can't help but wonder if they were all natural. I've heard that Whitley has been removed from his position at the Diocesan Archives and is no longer living at his boarding house. Official inquiries are met with the response that he has taken a leave of absence for his health. My source within the church hierarchy, who must remain anonymous even in these private pages, informs me that Whitley has been sent to the Worcester State Hospital for the Insane under a false name. October 25th, 1877. A groundbreaking discovery. Today, I have discovered a startling pattern in the death records and cemetery registers. In parishes where Whitley served or had access to because of his diocesan position, the death rate for young women between the ages of 18 and 30 is significantly higher than in similar parishes. And more, concerningly, the majority of these deaths were attributed to natural causes, fever, heart failure, or unexplained collapse, with no outward signs of violence. I cannot prove it, but I suspect Whitley may have progressed from violating the dead to creating his own brides through murder. The challenge is to establish any connection, especially when the families have every reason to avoid scrutiny and the official investigation has been closed. This concludes Father James Whitley's official record. After October 1877, his name does not appear in any church registry. There is no death certificate. His name is not on any grave. It seems as though he just disappeared from history, his presence meticulously obliterated by those with the authority and incentive to shield the church from disgrace. One last paper, though, offers a terrifying epilogue. 6 years after Whitley vanished, in 1883, the Worcester State Hospital for the Insane superintendent submitted a report about an unidentified patient, known only as Patient W., who had been kept in the maximum security ward since 1877. The patient remains in isolation by special arrangement with his sponsors. His condition has not improved. He continues to collect dead insects and small animals, which he arranges in disturbing tableaux. He performs ritual cleansing of these creatures and dresses them in garments fashioned from his own clothing. Most troubling are his writings, which describe in elaborate detail his sacred duty to prepare brides for the eternal marriage. When deprived of specimens, he becomes violent and speaks of the beautiful ones waiting in the earth. It is my professional opinion that Patient W will never be fit for release or public interaction. Several pages of the patient's writings, mostly in Latin but also in English, were included with this report. A disturbed mind convinced of a divine mission is revealed by the coherent passages. They do not understand the sacred nature of my work. The transition from life to death is not an ending, but a transformation. The body, purified through death, becomes the perfect vessel for divine union. I am merely the instrument, the bridegroom standing in for the ultimate bridegroom. Through me, these pure souls achieve the sacred marriage that ensures their salvation. Their families should thank me for my service, not condemn me to this prison of ignorance. Other passages are more disturbing, detailing in clinical detail the preparation of corpses and the rituals performed, interspersed with religious imagery and personal reflections that imply Whitley thought he was literally marrying the dead women in a spiritual sense. In a particularly disturbing piece he wrote, "The purity of the union is proportional to the freshness of the vessel. Those 3 days in the earth diminish the sanctity of the sacrament. The ideal is to perform the ritual at the precise moment of transition, when the soul has departed, but the body retains the warmth of life. In such moments, the veil between worlds is thinnest, and the marriage is most perfectly consummated. I have achieved this transcendent state only twice, but hope for more such sacred opportunities." This paragraph has terrifying ramifications, implying that Whitley had actually killed at least 2 young ladies in order to carry out his rituals on them at the exact time of transition. Both the victims' identities and the circumstances surrounding their deaths are still unknown. Boston's wealthy families made sure that such information would never be discovered. A note dated the 18th of December 1901 reads, "Patient deceased. remains cremated as per special arrangement, file sealed by order of the governor's office. This marks the end of the file. Despite being effectively demoted, Detective Francis Holloway never gave up on his investigation. He kept gathering data, compiling an extensive dossier on Whitley and the institutional cover-up that had permitted his operations to go forward. He tried publishing an account of the case in a local newspaper in 1882, but the edition was inexplicably removed from circulation before it could be circulated. The following week, the editor of the newspaper was discovered dead, apparently from suicide. After Holloway passed away from pneumonia in 1891 at the age of 57, his son inherited his voluminous archives, which he kept secret for decades out of fear of the influential parties who had silenced his father. In 1928, an elderly Thomas Holloway sent his father's records to a Boston Globe journalist in the hopes of finally making the story public. Thomas passed away in what was determined to be an unintentional fall down his cellar steps 3 days prior to their planned encounter. His residence appeared to have been searched extensively, and the records were not among his belongings. In his private email, journalist Michael Donovan pointed out the odd conditions, but his editors cautioned him to stop talking about it. Donovan subsequently wrote to a coworker, "There are stories that cannot be told in Boston, secrets that remain buried despite the passage of time." The Whitley affair is one such secret, protected not just by the church, but by the very families whose daughters were his victims. They would rather preserve their reputations than expose the truth, even now, generations later. One of the most unsettling periods in Boston's secret history is the case of Father James Whitley. It was purposefully suppressed by influential organizations in an effort to avoid scandal. Only shards of what formerly existed hint at atrocities that were meticulously hidden under Boston's dignified facade during the Gilded Age. Finally, in 1962, while renovating Trinity Church, workers found a tiny locked room beneath the crypt that was not part of the original blueprints. It contained what looked like human hair preserved in tiny glass vials, a notebook written in Latin, and a collection of ceremonial clothing identical to those mentioned in Holloway's writings. Unofficial reports state that church officials took these objects away and never acknowledged them in public. The renovation plans were changed to avoid that portion of the foundation, and the room was sealed. An even more unsettling discovery was made by one worker prior to the chamber being sealed: a stone altar with a Latin inscription that read, "To my eternal brides, awaiting our reunion in the world beyond." William Sullivan, the worker, wrote this in a letter to his brother, outlining his reasons for quitting his position at the rehabilitation site. Before being given to a tiny historical society in South Boston in 2009, the letter was still in the family's hands. Still unanswered is how, given Whitley's Catholic faith, these objects ended up being included into the basis of Trinity Church, an Episcopal organization. When Trinity was being built, the architectural blueprints were made public. Would Whitley have been able to enter the site when it was being built and set up this secret room? Or was there a larger plot, including several religious organizations that were all motivated to hide heinous crimes carried out in the name of twisted religion? Unnoticed documents from the building of Trinity Church might hold part of the solution. Several workers stated that, even though the building site was locked, tools and materials were occasionally found moving overnight as the main structure approached completion in the summer of 1876, while interior work went on. The foreman ascribed this to worker negligence or even to homeless people taking refuge in the incomplete structure. An even more important note is found in the August 1876 construction manager's log. Discovered evidence of unauthorized work in lower level. Small chamber constructed in northeast corner of foundation. Not in plans. Quality of stonework suggests professional hand. Investigation ongoing. There is no further entry about this investigation. Whitley continued to serve at his parish during this time. Church attendance records reveal that, months before Holloway would uncover his grave-robbing activities, Whitley occasionally attended services at Episcopal churches around Boston, including multiple visits to the Trinity Church construction site for what he told colleagues was architectural interest. This may be a tenuous connection, but it raises the possibility that Whitley was constructing his own covert shrine inside the magnificent new church, a perverse monument to his brides concealed within one of Boston's most revered places. Should that be the case, it would signify a symbolic violation of both Catholic and Episcopal traditions, as well as an unprecedented degree of preparation and deceit. The whole truth might never be revealed to us. Evidence has been lost to time, witnesses have been silenced, and records have been destroyed. What's left is a piecemeal description of terror concealed beneath Boston's dignified exterior in the 19th century. A reminder that people whose wickedness is concealed behind masks of respectability are the most unsettling monsters, not supernatural creatures. The narrative of the corpse-lover priest goes beyond James Whitley's personal dysfunction. It sheds light on the social mechanisms that allowed his actions to go on, such as the respect for religious leaders, the defense of affluent families, the preference for reputation above justice, and the readiness of institutions to hide rather than face evil within their own ranks. In many respects, the most unsettling part of the story is not the abnormal actions of a single disturbed person, but rather the cooperation of a respectable society in concealing his crimes. Dozens of people opted for silence over the truth and for the safety of institutions over the protection of victims for each severe violation committed by Whitley. As institutions ranging from churches to universities to political organizations decided to safeguard their reputations rather than reveal predators inside their ranks, this cycle would recur in Boston and other places. Even in death, the weak remain weak, and the strong defend their own. Trinity Church is now regarded as one of Boston's most renowned architectural gems. Every year, thousands of tourists enter, taking in its splendor without realizing the evil that previously hid in its shadows. Father Whitley's name has been wiped from history, and the only trace of his actions that remain is a few pieces of evidence that miraculously managed to avoid being destroyed. Perhaps it is the echo of those disturbed graves, of ceremonies carried out in the dark, of tragedies meticulously wiped from history, but never totally forgotten. Keep this in mind the next time you visit a historic cemetery in Boston and experience a chill that cannot be explained by the wind. And when you're in Trinity Church, looking up at its soaring arches and magnificent stained glass, keep in mind that beneath all of that beauty and grandeur, there is a foundation made of secrets, dark secrets, that powerful men went to considerable lengths to conceal, because they knew that some horrors were too great for a civilized society to accept. There is more to the story of the corpse-lover priest than just the depravity of one individual. It provides insight into the essence of Boston during the Gilded Age, a time of extreme contrasts when vast wealth coexisted with extreme poverty, where private corruption was concealed by public piety, and where the quest for respectability occasionally came at the expense of justice and the truth. Ultimately, the most unsettling aspect of this case may not be what we know, but rather what is always concealed, interred in unmarked graves, shut in forgotten chambers, burned in convenient fires, or kept in private collections, never to be seen again. One last terrifying possibility is that Whitley might not have been the only one involved in such operations if his crimes were so well hidden. Other occurrences are hinted at in the historical record: inexplicable serious disturbances, young women's unexplained deaths, and reports of covert rituals carried out by church or medical personnel who frequently interacted with the deceased. Think about the 1,879 suicide of Dr. Marcus Blackwood, a well-known doctor at Massachusetts General Hospital, who died when anonymous personal improprieties were revealed. His family promptly burned his vast collection of anatomical specimens after his passing. Or Father Thomas Merrick, who in 1880 was unexpectedly transferred to a remote parish in western Massachusetts without giving his flock any notice after serving for a short time at a parish in South Boston. These occurrences might have nothing to do with Whitley. They could just be coincidental events in a city that has had its fair share of tragedies and scandals. Alternatively, they might imply that Whitley's actions were a part of a more sinister pattern, one that went beyond a single troubled priest to include others who had the same or comparable perversions. A network of people who took advantage of their positions of power and trust to blur the lines between sacred and profane, life and death. The whole scope of these atrocities is probably unknown to us. The strong organizations that covered up Whitley's wrongdoings have remained secretive. Evidence has been purposefully withheld, witnesses have been silenced, and records have been destroyed. The remnants that are left suggest a sinister side that existed beneath Boston's honorable front throughout the Gilded Age. Some might contend that some stories are better left unsaid, and that such horrors are best left buried. However, history shows us that healing is rarely achieved by suppressing the truth. Rather, it festers below the surface, contaminating the soil that must be cultivated by future generations. As a tribute to the martyrs whose graves were invaded, whose eternal rest was disturbed, and whose families were denied the closure of learning the whole truth, we so relate this story. Imperfect and fragmented as it may be, we share it in honor of Detective Holloway, who gave up his profession to fight for justice. We tell it in honor of everyone who has ever been silenced by privilege and power. Because by telling, we guarantee that the truth, or at least parts of it, will endure, even if justice is never fully served. The best tribute we can give to those whose graves were disturbed on chilly Boston evenings in that far-off year of 1877 might be that. Perhaps more evidence is waiting to be found in some lost archive or private collection documents that would complete the gaps in our knowledge, materials that would expose the entire scope of Whitley's crimes and those who made them possible. Until then, all we have is this partial story, a narrative assembled from pieces that somehow managed to avoid destruction. It serves as a reminder that history includes not just the events that are formally documented, but also those that are purposefully left out. The tales that are seen to be too upsetting, too dangerous for authority, or too difficult for cozy narratives. The most significant facts about who we are and the society we have created are frequently hidden in these silences and gaps in the official record. When you stroll through Boston's streets today, past its old churches and cemeteries, keep in mind that beneath the glossy tales of development and religiosity, there is a darker past, one of exploitation, collusion, and secrets that have been hidden but never quite forgotten. The past is never really gone, because it endures in the institutions and structures we have inherited, as well as in the silences that endure over time. If we pay close attention to those silences, we may still be able to hear the voices of people whose stories were silenced, victims, whistleblowers, and those who sought the truth, but were met with resistance from those in positions of authority. Even though time and intentional erasure have muffled their voices, they nonetheless want justice, recognition, and the basic right to be recognized. We relate the story of the corpse lover priest to respect those whose last rest was broken and whose pain was exacerbated by society's inability to accept the reality. Not to sensationalize horror or disturb the quiet of the dead, we provide a tiny bit of the justice that was denied to them in life and in death by remembering them and sharing their tale, even if it is not complete. Therefore, let this story be both a warning and a memorial, a reminder of what occurs when organizations put their reputations before the truth, when authority goes unchecked, and when society prefers cozy silence to uncomfortable reality. Because most of the monsters who walk among us are human, dressed in respectable clothing, and shielded by the same institutions that are supposed to protect us from them. And perhaps the most lasting terror of all is that